Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us in the second of a four-part webinar series hosted by SAFE called CCP China Competition Power. I'm Leslie Hayward, Senior Vice President of Public Affairs here at SAFE, and we're proud to be hosting this conversation to bring experts into to speak about the challenges that the global economy is facing because of China's hybrid economy and their approach to strategic competition. So we have a great panel here today. Thank you to all our registered guests for submitting questions in advance. If you missed our first episode, there's going to be a link in the chat, and we encourage you to take a moment to review that episode because it covers a lot of the questions that are brought up by today's audience. But we're going to go a layer deeper in our conversation, and we're going to talk specifically about how the Chinese Communist Party's efforts are undermining global innovation and global competition. So I'll take a moment to introduce our panelists. First is Rick Switzer. He is principal at Projects and a former State Department official who spent much of his life in China. And we're very grateful that he's kind of become a historian in residence for us here at SAFE. Second, we have Rob Atkinson, who is the president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. We also have Jonathan Ward, who is author of The Decisive Decade and China's Vision of Victory. He's also a fellow at the Hudson Institute. And we have Chris Cloutier, an international trade lawyer and partner at Chagrin Associates. So I'm going to turn to Rick first. Rick, you gave us an amazing historical overview of China's hybrid economic model in the last session. I think you're going to drill in a little bit more on the impact on global industry today. So I'm going to hand off to you.
Thank you so much. And thanks to SAFE for having us. Thanks to this amazing assemblage of experts here. Really excited to be talking about this topic. So last time, I spent quite a long time talking about how the five-year plans work, sort of the basis of China's what I call a hybrid economy. And I call it that because it's not like any other economy in the world. It's more controlled and structured than any other economy. As I mentioned, probably 70% of the Chinese economy is controlled by the state, right? And one of the primary tools at their disposal for meeting the five-year plans ambitions is what we broadly call industrial policy, right? And that's what the topic here today is, to talk about China's industrial policy broadly. And so industrial policy can be seen sort of just, in a most broadest sense as anything that a government does in an attempt to increase the industrial capacity or outcomes of industrial capacity within their nation state. Other scholars like Chalmers Johnson looked at sort of Japan and how MITI worked, and there have been folks who've looked at how China's industrial policy works in general. I think many times Western scholars and academicians miss how deeply rooted the industrial policy is in China's long-term strategy, what they're trying to achieve, and what they're willing to give up. And so what you see is many times, and professors I studied, and I won't name any, but professors I studied on who've written extensively on this and who are great scholars, will take their reviews of industrial policy or their reviews of China's economy in general as an attempt to try to help Beijing figure out how to do better, how to be more like us, right? To tell them, this really isn't working for you. You've done so many great things. Zhu Rongji, who I'll talk about in a minute, and I think I talked about last time, is sort of lauded by many of these folks as the great economic tactician of China's economy that sort of led the reform, the post-reform and opening up period into the sort of modern era, the WTO accession. And it's all done in a very friendly manner. When you go, especially if you haven't lived there, what happens is folks get co-opted very easily. It's very easy to sort of show up as a CEO or an investor or a government official or an academic who hasn't ever actually really lived there, probably doesn't speak Chinese, certainly can't read characters. And so your view is very sort of curated, right, by the party and by folks that you interact with. And their goal is to be very friendly to you. And so it may seem like they're interested in your advice. And certainly before COVID, for most folks, that was their sort of takeaway. But the reality is that China's industrial policy is rooted in early Mao structures that are designed to capture global market share. The goal is to turn China into a very powerful the most powerful industrial state. And it isn't about developing China for China's people's sake. It's about the party and their long-term goals of becoming the most powerful nation really in Asia and I think lately in the world. And so they don't mind losing money. They don't mind overcapacity. They do things that, from a purely economic perspective, sort of Ricardian structure, or Adam Smithian type perspective, that make zero sense. And so when academicians and CEOs go there, they always sort of revert back to what they know, and they're always trying to find, sort of Ryan, they're trying to look through the lens of us, like how do we figure this out? And so one of the things I think you should really start with is that with industrial policy, and I'll go through the specifics of how their industrial policy works, but one of the things that you hear about is sort of overcapacity. We've been having these discussions on overcapacity for a very long time. When Westerners and sort of folks who were raised in that sort of canon look at overcapacity, the assumption is that something went wrong. Somebody did something wrong and the market is going to have to fix something. But in the Chinese perspective, overcapacity is actually a feature of the project that they're undertaking. It's not a bug. It wasn't a mistake. They know their goal is to achieve overcapacity, not just their own domestic overcapacity, but that their overcapacity is going to drive profits out of the industry. And by driving profits out of the industry, they're going to put market-based firms at a distinct disadvantage because no market-based firm can continue to lose money for as long as a PRC firm. So in practice, their industrial policy, which they've had a series of policies, the most recent of which, I mentioned last time, it's sort of Made in China 2025, the dual circulation plan, and plans that the certain 5-year plans that go before it. They have a series of tools available to them. But the metric that they start with is we intend to take some percentage of the global market share. Now, foreign firms or foreign imports may, at that time, account for some large percentage of the Chinese market as well as the international market. But the benchmark is not, we want to create a world-class firm, say maybe the Japanese or Korean model. We want to create globally competitive firms, say like a Samsung. And so we don't worry about the rest of the stuff. As long as we have this competitive champion, we feel pretty good about ourselves. That's not the metric that Fa Gaiwei, the National Development Reform Council folks who do the 5-year plans, that's not the metric they're using. The metric is the world produces X tonnage of this, and by this date, we expect, if we meet our goals, that China will be 60% of global production. That's the goal, and however you get there is fine, right? They prefer if you don't lose money, but if you do, that's fine. And so some of the tools available to the planners and to really the entire party apparatus who, once it's inculcated in the 14th 5-year plan, this is how you get promoted, right? You meet the metric in the 14th 5-year plan, your annual review benchmarks against what you were supposed to be doing. And so if that's the metric, it doesn't matter how you got there. And so the tools that they have available to them are clearly, obviously, subsidies. There are real estate subsidies. There are non-recognized environmental subsidies. For a large number of industries, the PRC was able to get ahead because they simply ignored the environmental costs and decided that they would zero those out for their firms, where those are enormous costs, particularly in manufacturing for US firms. Meeting that environmental mitigation is a very high barrier and a very costly barrier, but for the PRC, they will just literally zero it out. Subsidized bank loans, state-directed bank loans, provincial government investment in infrastructure that would be necessary, subsidies for energy, water, primary inputs. In addition, there's things like window guidance, and that is sort of with the banks, you tell them where you want them to invest, or if there are foreign competitors that maybe have a product that, because the industrial base is so much older, can actually compete on price, the window guidance to the SOEs or to the banks or whoever it is would be, you're not really allowed to buy from them. You have to buy from us. It's not in any law or rule, so it's very hard to use sort of current sort of international trade structures to remedy it. There are many others, and I think a very good example of how this works in practice is what happened with the shipbuilding industry. So in 2000, the government identified, there was a Marine sort of industry commission identified by the government, by the State Council, that this was an important industry China should be considering. Zhu Rongji in 2002 gave a speech, and in that speech, it was, and why I mention this, this is a roadmap. This is a standard roadmap that almost follows identical for every industry, whichever it is. Whether it's semiconductors, it starts with a speech. or the solar panels. It's pretty amazing, actually, how much on script they stay. So you start with initially as a decision somewhere in the government that this is important. Then some very senior leader comes and gives a speech. And that speech is the beginnings of telling the party apparatus, the folks who run the banks and everything else, these aren't bankers, right? State banks are run by party officials. You're telling them that this is important to us, right? And so soon thereafter, the State Council will put out an actual plan, which they did, so that by 2003, there was a plan, China's maritime shipbuilding plan that came out. And then by 2005, it had made its way into the 14th five-year plan. Well, when the speech was given, the China was about 7% of global shipbuilding production. By 2005, even before they fully inculcated in the 14th five-year plan, the apparatus had moved to the point where China was now 13% of global production. You fast forward to 2008 and the global financial crisis, when everyone else is cutting back and ships aren't being built and no one's buying ships, and Japan and Korea, who were leaders at that point, are actually laying folks off and reducing their capacity, China doubles down. They increase the investment, they increase the number of shipyards, and they do what I like to call sort of let 1,000 flowers bloom, which is was a political strategy, but it's an identical strategy for companies, which is they want to create a bunch of companies, right? So what they do is they turn the spigot on, and everybody who wants to make their numbers and get promoted, or just generate commerce so that they can get corruption and graft, they all pour in, right? Local governments, state governments, big cities, province, central government. And so at one point there were more shipbuilding companies launched in a year in China than existed in the rest of the world, right? So you had hundreds of shipbuilding companies. No country needs hundreds. They know this is part of their strategy, right? So as that overcapacity begins to build, what you start to see is that some companies actually have figured it out. Some of the companies that show up, right, they're not picking specific winners at this point. They're just throwing immense amounts of capital and stuff at it. But then the next thing that comes out is they come out with a whitelist, right? So then they come forward and they say, hey, you know what? Now, and one of the things that happens when you do this is that you have basically told all the banks and everyone else who's really risking state money on these investments that you're fine, you're not going to get in trouble. You can lose money, you can bankrupt this thing, and you're not going to be in trouble. Typically, if you take a big risk on something like that, it can actually cost you your life in their economic system. They're quite literally, they have laws that put you to death for economic crimes. They've killed 2 of their equivalent FDA administrators for this. So, but then they come in with the whitelist, and what the whitelist says, no, only this 100 companies can now get state finance, can get bank financing. Well, that essentially means that everybody else who's not on that whitelist is going to go out of business, right? And what happens is most of those assets get absorbed by the more powerful ones. And then as that sort of moves forward, they start to refine the list and refine the champions. And then they figure out, well, who's really globally competitive at this point, right? Who can compete, who can produce at a cheap price. We keep all the subsidies in place, we keep all those. And then they turned on, is what they did in shipbuilding, they turned on the China Export-Import Bank, and they turned on really low-cost loans, and they started undercutting anyone else. So to the point where you just really couldn't, even if you gave the ship away from Korea at like what the material cost you, you couldn't compete.
Right.
The Koreans had to step in actually with their own industrial policy to compete against that. And so where you end up is that no market-based firm can compete. And so today, for instance, or even in 2020, today they're over 60% of global shipbuilding capacity. In 2020, the PRC had 40 times the deadweight tonnage production of the United States. This is not a safe place to be for the United States. Okay, so that's sort of fun, like in practice, how their industrial policy works. It plays out across every single industry you can imagine. Today, it's playing out across semiconductors, and the PRC's put $200 billion, probably more, but most estimates for folks who've really looked at it, including myself, put the number around $200 to $250 billion in direct subsidies into semiconductors, and they're quite frankly willing to lose $2 trillion to gain control of the semiconductor industry. You can't compete against that on a subsidies basis. And so another one is Boeing. I think Boeing and Airbus are the perfect example right now of how companies took short-term sort of decisions, governments decided not to intervene, and right now Airbus is laying people off because their equivalent to the A320 is losing orders. Most of the new orders for the COMAC 919 are coming from Chinese firms. 15 years from now, Airbus and Boeing are going to be very, very bad shape, and it's going to be Paris, Washington, and Boeing and Airbus's fault for how we get. I'll leave it there, and I don't want to take too much time from everybody else, but.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's, I mean, it's fascinating. It's also a little frightening. Rob, I would love to turn to you and hear a little bit about what ITIF has been observing in this space, and how is this playing out in the tech and telecommunications sector?
Well, look, if you're not frightened, you're not paying attention. I mean, I really think that's the core message. What's that line? You be afraid, be very afraid. I'm not kidding. I'm quite serious. I agree with everything Rick said. I think the core thing that we don't understand in the United States, and particularly in Washington, the core thing we don't understand is our system is a process-based system. Why do we want competition? We want an antitrust regime that does why? Well, because it leads to the best results, ipso facto. We want light touch regulation. Why? Because it leads to the best results, ipso facto. We want taxes that don't privilege anything. Why? And so we look at it as we're just this thing called the market. We want it to work, but it's not goal directed. That's really the key thing. It's process directed. The entire sort of OECD Western economic system is all about process. And so that's why you can get a statement like Michael Boskin made years ago, potato chips, computer chips, what's the difference? And I want you to understand, that was not an anomaly. That was not some guy who didn't know what he was talking about. That is what people believe. So there's no goal here. There's no goal. We don't have a goal. The goal is to not have 28% of global production as opposed to 24. The goal is not to have chips, although recently we've begun to go in that direction. That's not China. China is teleological. They're goal-directed. Their goal is very simple, and that is global techno-economic dominance. You're not supposed to say that. It's just a competition or, look, this is about dominance. This is about them beating us. This is about them beating OECD nations, driving their global market shares, particularly of advanced industries. Now, why are advanced industries important? Advanced industries are different than commodity-based industries for two big reasons. The main reason is they have what economists call high fixed costs and low marginal costs. If you want to open up a call center, let's say the Chinese destroyed all our call centers, or maybe that was the Indians. Who cares? Because if we just wanted to put a tariff on calls, we would replicate our call center industry within 30 days. It's not very hard. You buy a bunch of switches, you train some people, you give them scripts, bang, you're up. If we were to lose Boeing, it's gone forever. The reason it's gone forever is there's so many fixed costs in there of R&D, of learning, of manufacturing know-how. So companies have to spend an enormous amount of money to get the first product off the door. That's particularly true in software, particularly true in drugs, but it's also true in semiconductors. It can cost $3 or $4 billion just to design and implement the very first chip. So what that means is two things. Global market size is critical. That's why this sort of notion that we should sort of have an American market is so antithetical to global innovation. Global market size is critical because the last chip you sell is the one you make the most money on. The first one you're losing. So you're losing, and then finally your sales get big enough to recoup. If the Chinese, number one, close their market, which they're doing to us, and secondly, go out and Belt and Road and essentially capture all that, and then have their firms and go attack our firms in other markets, including our market, essentially what happens is we lose those sales and we have the inability to reinvest back into R&D, design, and all these other things. So it becomes what some economists have called cumulative causation. You invest less in the next round of competition you're weaker, et cetera, et cetera. And the second component of that is if you're investing a lot of money in an innovation and you can have your competitor copy it immediately, you're not going to do that because you would have no economic incentive. That's why we have patents. The Chinese are able to go around that. Number one, they don't respect patents in their own domestic market. But secondly, the amount of intellectual property theft, you just can't underestimate it. It is orders of magnitude larger than we think. They're just, that's the way they get a lot of their technology. So what does that mean? And what that means is that the Chinese system has been degrading global innovation. And the reason it's been degrading, let me give you an example of telecom. Huawei got its first switch essentially given to them by the government. The government had funded it. Where did they get that from? They got that from Western companies putting facilities in China. And why did the Western companies like Lucent and Siemens and all of these companies, NTT, why did they put that in China? Because they were told, if you don't put your factory in there and if you don't teach us, we will not buy your product. So essentially what that means is it means that your investments in your own R&D go down. So let's look at, for example, solar panels. Chinese dominate solar panels. I think they're up to 74% now, something like that in the global market.
80.
And up to 80?
Yeah.
Okay.
Certain segments is 90.
They used to be around 5. We used to be around 60. What year did solar panel patenting peak? This was a series of studies we did, looked at 6 different industries in terms of the effect on innovation, biotechnology, semis, telecom equipment, and high-speed rail and others. Solar panel patenting peaked in 2010. And the reason it peaked in 2010 was by that time there was so little money left to reinvest. The Chinese were just basically dominating it all, and they weren't really investing in innovation. They were investing in process innovation, how to build the solar panels. So we're seeing that across the board. Now, one of the things that's different, though, now is that the Chinese are starting to independently innovate on their own. So they want to crush our ability to innovate, but what they're doing is innovating broadly. Just give you a few quick examples. There's a series of reports that ITIF is in the middle of finishing up for a big major study. We're looking at 9 industries in terms of innovation capabilities in China. Robotics, nuclear power, AI, quantum, semiconductors, electric vehicles. China is deploying under construction right now more nuclear power plants than the entire world. They're spending more on quantum R&D, government R&D, than every other government in the world combined. Their robotics innovation center in China is about 10 to 20 times larger in funding than the US Robotics Innovation Center in Pittsburgh that they copied theirs off of. The magnitude of money and resources and bodies that they're putting into this now is really phenomenal. So what China's done is they initially were kind of commodity production, make your widgets there. They started to move up. They started to try to become a fast follower. And the value proposition was we'd come into these markets, the Chinese come into these markets. We'll give you something that's pretty good, like a Huawei piece of equipment, not as good as Nokia or Ericsson or Samsung, but we'll give it to you for 25% less. That's pretty powerful. What they're doing now is basically going to go into market and say, we'll give you something that's 100% the same, if not better, and we're going to give it to you for 25% less. And the reason they can do the 25% less is because of these massive subsidies that Rick alluded to, and through their Ex-Im Bank, through not having to pay taxes, just a wide array of things. So, you know, just to finish up, everybody in this, not everybody, luckily people on the panel aren't in this space, but the debate in Washington is all about a few industries, semiconductors, quantum AI, look, this is fantastically broader than that. If the US did not have an aerospace industry, a machinery industry, a car industry, we would be a decimated UK-like economy. I mean, we just cannot let that happen. So the point is, this is a lot deeper, it's a lot broader, and it's a lot more severe than I think a lot of people in Washington think. Just putting a few export controls on some chips, that's like throwing some sand at a freight train that's running at you. It's not going to do what we need it to do. So.
Thank you, Rob. I think, Jonathan, you're going to drill in a little bit more on the specific companies, those critical industries that Rob just mentioned.
And also zooming out a little bit on why this matters at the level of Chinese grand strategy. And part of that is that what this really adds up to is another element of Chinese strategy, which is the ability, as they put it, to fight and win wars, including against the United States. So I think this is something we really have to understand. I mean, Rob's absolutely right to show this is a whole of economy effort. What they call it is having a complete industrial economy. That's the terminology they use. But as Admiral Aquilino said at U.S. Indo-Pacific Command in his final testimony to Congress this year, China is basically undertaking the largest military buildup since the Second World War, and it's taking place across every single domain. So you add up the economic strategies, which all are part of a holistic system here. So from the 5-year plans to dual circulation to Made in China 2025, Belt and Road for trade, and then the companies going global. I mean, this all adds up to what they seek to build as industrial dominance, and then converting that into war-making potential. So when you take, for example, Rick's example of the shipbuilding industry, where we've heard what that is, they can outbuild the U.S. 200-to-1 in shipbuilding, and that was released by the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence recently. So all of this has real-world military implications, and that's part of their overall strategy, is to ultimately be able to fight and win wars against the United States from the position of industrial and technological superiority. And in case we'd like to go back to history for examples. In the Second World War, in the 1930s, ahead of the Second World War, the United States gross national product was 3 times the combined power of Germany and Japan today. At the end of the day, that's what it meant to awaken the sleeping giant, was our industrial might. Today, we are 15% of global industrial output, and China is 30%. So they are double our industrial base. And we basically did that through what we pretend is free trade, which it's not. I mean, we're trading into the most sophisticated set of industrial strategies probably ever designed. I've been spending some time on that, looking at a counter strategy. And you go through these, and they've checked off every sector that matters, every technological subcomponent. They've wrapped it up into an economic grand strategy that underpins what they call the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which is their overall quest for strategic dominance. And that one can read about in great depth. But one of the elements that I'd like to bring up here is also the role of companies in this strategy, because that's how they actually execute their grand strategies. As I wrote in China's Vision of Victory, Chinese companies are really, they're the elements of Chinese grand strategy. That's how they get it done. So, whether we're looking at their share of the Fortune Global 500, where they've now surpassed us in terms of the number of companies on the Fortune Global 500, or when we look and drill down into each of the 5-year plans or general industrial strategies where they're creating national champions through decades worth of intellectual property theft and then putting them out onto world markets in order to pursue the long-term vision of dominance. I mean, that's how they get this done, which also makes it highly targetable. If and when we want to take apart Chinese grand strategy, we can do it by targeting the corporate entities, the banking entities, and the strategic entities that the CCP uses to control the global economy. And you'll see just by reading a 5-year plan, the Communist Party is at the center of every single aspect of Chinese industrial strategy and the Chinese economy in general. I want to use an example for the sake of electric vehicles today, just to show a bit of where we are in one sector. And I'd like to use a China example and then a US example. So BYD, the big famous Chinese example, Build Your Dreams, it's called. And this is from a report from a good Chinese sort of primary source-based research company called Radar Lock that was released a few years ago. And they talk about BYD's place in civil-military fusion, which is the larger program of trying to bring China's civilian innovation into their military sector. And there's no way around that. The whole system is designed to pull industrial might into military capacity. And here's what they say. They're talking about a high-tech industrial development zone in Xi'an, which says, in its own words, it implements the party and state guidelines to further the military industry and local economic development through the national defense, science, and technology industry and military civil fusion. That's what the development center talks about. And then BYD is part of this because China pulls companies together, it creates national teams, it looks to sort of put together aspects of technology that companies are developing, such as sensors, which would have military applications, or pretty much anything that can be crossed over. And here's where it is. In this industrial park with Norinco, which is one of the big defense companies, AVIC, which is China's Aviation Industry Corporation, China Electronics Technology Group, that's a pretty nasty human rights sort of abuser, central to Chinese surveillance, China Aerospace Architecture Design, BYD sits alongside National Private Weaponry Aerospace Aviation Marine Automation Electronics and Internet of Things developers. They put it all together in order to achieve these effects. So any company that we're looking at in any strategic sector likely has these sorts of ties. And plenty of people have done good work on that. So again, they're taking these broader industrial strategies, converting them into military power as best they can in order to fulfill a grand strategy that includes the use of their military. And they were prolific users of military force in the 20th century. As a historian of modern China, something that I have done some work on here. And let's go to the Tesla example here. I mean, this is a company that's very interesting because it has so much exposure to China risk in general. And there's something that's very interesting in the Tesla annual report. And it's been in there for multiple years in a row. And this gets back to the problem of intellectual property theft. In my work with Fortune 500s over the last bunch of years, I've gotten to know a lot of chief security officers. And as one of them explained to me very clearly, what we try to tell our CEOs is anything you put in China, they're going to get it. There's no way to protect it. So just look at it that way. Now imagine this. In the Tesla annual report, they list out all of their manufacturing centers. And then in the Gigafactory Shanghai, there's an asterisk under owned or leased. And what that asterisk goes to, we own the building and land use rights with an initial term of 50 years. And then it says we have an operating lease arrangement over this 50-year period. And then there are capital expenditure minimums and revenue minimums. So essentially, on the basis of investing a certain amount of capital and selling a certain amount of cars into the market, they can lease this factory from the Chinese government. I think that's another extreme from simply not being able to protect your IP. In this case, so that's what our companies are up against. In China's Vision of Victory, I used an example that a Chinese telecommunications executive told me once years ago, where he said China is a giant incubator. We basically take the technology and capital from foreign firms. This was back when we really had decisive technology advantages. Then we incubate it in the China market. We put it onto world markets. So that's what we're dealing with. And if we don't stop this now, this conversation 5 years from now, 10 years from now, is going to be not about what we do, but about we missed. We failed to achieve any. You stop it now. This is the last chance we've got.
Thank you for that. Don't worry, it's not just about be afraid, be very afraid. We're also going to keep talking about solutions, not just in this conversation, but also in our future ones. And specifically, we're going to drill in on how to close that 15% to 30% gap. But first, we want to make sure that Chris has a moment to, as a practitioner of international law, has a moment to talk about how this law has played out in some of the cases that he's worked on.
Thank you for that. And thank you for making me part of this panel. It's really fantastic. It's a pleasure to speak to you about international trade law. It's been a banner couple of years for people with my worldview. The conversation has really changed. For a long time, there was this orthodoxy of free trade, which is not free. There are, in fact, rules. And I think President Trump accurately recognized the threat that is China, and through the Section 301 and in a different way through Section 232 for the steel and aluminum industries has really changed the conversation. The Biden administration has more or less kept the same policies in place. There's no talk of actually dialing any of this back with respect to China. It's just a question of, is it being effective, and can we keep going? Or so let me take a step back, I guess, just for a minute, back to 2001 when China joined the World Trade Organization. This was the beginning of a process that you've heard a lot about today, where China joined the world economy. It agreed to abide by certain rules. There is a long accession protocol, which it writes out what exactly China has to do to become a member of the World Trade Organization, and then by becoming a member, it gets access to all the other members' markets on most favored nation terms. And one of the provisions in that protocol was about state-owned enterprises. And it said specifically that state-owned enterprises will make their decisions on commercial terms. I think what you've heard today is that is not at all how things have played out. State-owned enterprises play an important, if not key role in Chinese policies and industrial policy in particular. We have seen over the last several years more and more Chinese Communist Party cells being incorporated into otherwise commercially driven companies to make sure that the party's will is done. And there's been a real regression, I think, in terms of the trade liberalization we were all hoping for back in 2001 when we agreed to let China into the party. In preparation for today's call, I was going through my White House briefing book back from 2001, which had a bunch of press reports and analysis for policymakers to use to try to sell permanent normal trade relations for China to the public and to Congress. And I was just shocked by some of it. It was described as a one-way street where allowing China into the WTO is going to allow us to drive down our trade deficit because we would be exporting so much to China. That is not at all how things turned out. It's also, part of it, I was struck by how out of date all of the agreements are. One of the things that the administration was really excited about was our access to their information technology market and the fact that we were going to be able to sell pagers to people in China. It's just looking back at it 20 years, none of this has aged well. Going forward, I think President Trump has, former President Trump has promoted a vision where we would impose duties of 60% on all of Chinese imports and another 10% on imports from other places. 10 years ago, I would have told you that was a pipe dream, not possible. But then the innovation that we saw with President Trump and international trade law was really remarkable. The things that did happen are we now have 25% tariffs on just a phone book full of tariff classifications of products from China. But 25% is not enough. The Chinese just keep coming. And I'm seeing many of my clients are domestic producers of steel products, of certain chemicals, and we are seeing Chinese imports actually increasing, notwithstanding the imposition of the 25% tariff. So I think there might be room for a 60% tariff on imports of goods from China into the United States. The problem is that leaves the rest of the world for the Chinese. So whoever the next administration is, I think a really important thing for them is to get the rest of the world to go along with us if they want to be part of our club. If they want to be part of the Chinese club, they can do whatever they want. But I think we need a more holistic approach because while we can wall off America from Chinese imports, there's a whole lot of the rest of the world out there. Happy to take any other questions or if we want to move on.
If I might, one thing I want to sort of just to quickly double down on because I think it's important to say, which is that there's a lot of talk from companies that the Chinese market is so vast. The reality is in almost every case, the US market from a profit base is bigger. Pharmaceuticals, for instance, the total is larger. The US is 40% of all pharmaceutical sales, PRC is 12. 40% of all servers installed on the planet are installed within the United States. Things like vehicles are exaggerated. The kinds of cars that China, many of the ones that are vehicles actually are no better than golf carts. The profitability on the vehicles that are sold are much, much lower. So even where the US in absolute terms is not the largest market, in many cases it actually really is if you look beyond the numbers and dig into it, but certainly on a profitability base. The US is by far the most profitable market in the world. We subsidize global drug discovery because of the profitability of our drug market, for instance. And so while we don't want to be Fortress America, we should not discount how very powerful this market is. The rest of the world will choose the US market over the China market if they're forced to choose. Aside from a handful of commodities, there really isn't a single market where the US market isn't vastly more profitable. And clearly your firms can compete on a fair market-based structure, which we've already talked about many, many times. We talked about last session. There is no such thing as a fair market-based structure in competition in the PRC. So.
Right, and I really, again, just to point people back to the first episode, because Rick and the other guests do an amazing job talking about the human rights cost, the environmental cost of the brute force economic approach as Liza Tobin talks us through it. And it's really, again, fear fear everywhere. But anyway, I want to be mindful of time, and this is a great panel. I know we could talk for hours, but let's drill in on that counter strategy. Chris, as you point out, Washington has been awake to this risk. Trade policy is one tool in the toolkit, but it's a very blunt instrument. What else can we really be doing to break apart this civil-military fusion? What are our most powerful weapons, and how can we move fast enough? I'm going to kick to Jonathan first.
Sure. So I think we have a major opportunity to actually win this competition in the near term and especially in the long run. And the strategy that I wrote out in The Decisive Decade, essentially in response to Chinese strategy. I mean, if you actually wanted to dismantle the global grand strategy of the People's Republic of China as it exists, you have to start with the economic center. And realizing that for the most part, their next phase in strategy, the actual completion of what they call the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation across every single subcomponent, still relies on access to the world economy. It relies on access substantially to the US economy, to the US alliance system, which, as we saw with NATO and Washington just a couple of weeks ago, I mean, we're half of the world's economy alone as NATO. It relies on access to the world's capital markets, where we have massive, overwhelming advantages. And the US is still the world's largest economy. So in terms of GDP, in terms of national wealth, in terms of capital markets, both equity and fixed income, in terms of a whole range of other metrics other than industrial base and other than specific strategic industries where we will have to regain ground, we have the ability, I think, to shape their economic destiny, to shape our own economic destiny, and to retain that premier position, build that into peace through strength, hold the position in the island chains, bring the alliance systems together, both in Asia and in Europe, and retain essentially the free world as we know it by pushing China out in three major categories: markets, technology, and capital. And there are a whole lot of ways in the US toolkit to do that. If we do that now in the 2020s, they never surpass us. If we fail to do this, if we fail to really get a grip on executing a strategy, I think they're going to make substantial gains in enough strategic industries to generally have a position in world trade that will lead to broader strategic power. And that's a world we don't want to be in. So we have these advantages now that we can start to use to restructure the world economy so they cannot complete the ascendancy and we retain our position. And that's all we really have to do. But the battle space becomes one that's not only about Washington, D.C. It's going to be about Wall Street. It's going to be about C-suites. It's going to be about corporate boards. And it's going to be about doing this as much of the world economy as we can possibly assemble to put a major counterpoint towards the Chinese, general strategies.
So you're talking about Wall Street. You're talking about companies. Given how the advantages that have been seized by China in terms of shoring production in their country, and when you talk to companies today, their hands are tied. They really don't feel like they have other options. So I'm going to open up to the rest of the panel. What are the other ways that the U.S. Can help reshore that production and break that stranglehold?
Well, I think one of the things I worry about is, if we had 60% tariffs on China, it would certainly have an effect, but there are two problems with that. One is there would be a dollar compensation, so the US dollar would go up. I mean, that's exactly what happened with the tariffs that President Trump put in place, is the Chinese devalued the yuan. And so they were neutral, whereas our prices were higher. So it was actually flipped it completely. I'm troubled by the fact that most people in Washington on both sides of the aisle are defenders of a strong dollar. I think that has to go. The idea of a strong dollar, like who's against a strong dollar? The strong dollar is essentially a tariff on or price on US exports and a subsidy on US imports. But I think how we have to approach this is not a battle about the trade deficit. It's not a battle about US manufacturing. I don't care whether the Chinese are producing T-shirts. I don't care whether they're producing commodity-based metal things like hammers. It doesn't matter. What matters are 20, 30 really important industries that are fundamentally underlying national power. That's what we need to focus on. And we could do that if we wanted to. One of the things we've proposed is revitalize a thing called, Section 337. just basically ban the imports of certain Chinese products from Chinese companies, not the products, everything they make, where we can make a convincing case that they're competing unfairly. Why are we allowing them into our market and then getting our allies to do a similar kind of allied 3-3-7 approach? That's kind of on the defensive side. On the offensive side, I think we're just going to have to bite the bullet and say, there seems to be a growing and correct consensus that we have to expand defense funding, particularly around new weapon systems. Absolutely agree with that. We have to think about this domestic investment the way we think about buying an F-35. We're not buying F-35s because we think they're going to grow our economy. We're buying them because we have to defend ourselves. We have to do chips to defend, the chip subsidies to defend ourselves. I think we've got to just think that we're going to be putting in $150 billion a year in a wide array of subsidies, whether directly through sort of grants like we did with chips or through tax policy. And we're going to focus that on the industries that we cannot lose. Otherwise, if we're not willing to spend that money, I don't see how we can ultimately compete with what China's doing.
Mm-hmm.
Something that I'm very excited about, and Rick, you were talking about shipbuilding earlier, but earlier this year, my law firm filed a 301 petition with the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative on Chinese shipbuilding, and how all of the subsidies that Rick talked about are essentially preventing our shipbuilding industry from coming back. I think last year we made 10 ocean-going vessels, 10. The Chinese made more than 1,000. I mean, this is a significant industry. The Chinese have identified it as significant, both in, Make China 2025 and
It goes back to 2000, literally.
When
was
SASAC identified, the 7 industries that must be under state control. I think they're not wrong in that respect, and I think we need to do some of the same things here. Our proposed remedy there is a $1 million tax on Chinese-made ships coming into the U.S., which we figured out would be something like $50 a container, and then that money would be used to help, sort of like the CHIPS Act, but to help bring commercial shipbuilding back.
If I may, I think to Rob's point, I think I was saying this earlier, when we definitely talked about this last time, when you're dealing with a country where the government controls essentially 70% of the economy, right, and where, as Rob rightly pointed out, the currency sort of they devalue the yuan, that made up for most of the tariffs. When you throw those two things together, even a 60% tariff, I mean, for some things, no, but for the strategic things, as I said earlier, they're willing to literally, to waste $2 trillion if it means they're going to capture the market for semiconductors. They know, quite literally, if you talk AI, if you talk software, if you talk cyber, all that's hardware, all that's a chip, right? Nothing happens, this conversation doesn't happen, cars don't move, planes don't fly, nothing happens without microchips, right? If you control microchips, you control the fundamental foundation of the modern world, full stop, right? Go into a John Deere combine and count how many semiconductors are in there, right? It's a very, very high-tech product, actually, and it harvests 60% of the food in this country. So if you find yourself in a world where you can't keep the John Deere combines going because the chips that make them work all come from Taiwan and China, and oh, by the way, there's a conflict going on there and you can't get chips. Now you're in a world where you can't feed yourself, right? I mean, this doesn't go that far. And so already for many segments of the legacy semiconductors, the PRC controls 60% of global production. And the design firms who are designing, we'll talk about this a lot next time, who are designing some of the chips, they're going there because it's cheaper. It's the place to get your chip sourced because you're selling commodity chips on price, and no one else is going to produce commodity chips cheaper than the PRC. But how do they make those chips? They buy semiconductor manufacturing equipment and software from the United States, Europe, and Japan, right? So we have an industry that is quite literally maybe an $80 billion industry, that is the semiconductor manufacturing industry, that feeds into a $600 billion industry, which is the chip making industry. So now you have folks who are arguing, well, AMAT and Tokyo Electron and ASML, they've got to sell those semiconductor equipment to somewhere. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to invest in R&D. You're destroying their customers in the long term. Eventually, once they become the primary customers of all these companies, when they put out of business all the US and European-based chip manufacturers, they'll then put ASML and AMAT and Tokyo Electron out of business as well. Boeing and Airbus are a very good example of this. The COMAC CJ919 does not fly without Honeywell, without GE, without Rolls-Royce, without BAE Systems, and all the other folks, right? And so what are they doing? Who are their primary customers? Boeing and Airbus are those companies' primary customers. So they're gaining market share from a new entrant who is looking to put their existing customer base out of business. But that existing customer, that new customer, is going to eventually want to put BAE and Honeywell out of the aviation business as well. They stay in business with Airbus and Boeing because Boeing doesn't want to replace Honeywell. They don't want to replace GE engines. The PRC has a plan for they have a mirror company in the Made in China 2025, in the dual circulation plan. There's a mirror company for every one of those companies. There's a mirror company for Honeywell for their avionics. There's a mirror company for GE. So right now they're selling CJ919s and they're destroying Boeing over the long term, but tomorrow they're going to be destroying Honeywell as well. And so this is the short-termism that needs to be addressed, and it can only be addressed through a comprehensive strategic economic security and national security policy that says, we're simply not going to let you buy Honeywell equipment to put Boeing out of business. We're not going to let you buy AMAT to put Texas Instruments out of business. And oh, by the way, we're not going to buy your processed chips in our cars and because of their strategic nature, because we know you've been subsidizing the industry in order to take control of a critical industry that we can't afford to lose. And 60% tariffs may be helpful, but I think Rob's point is the right one. So some of these, the answer is full stop, you're not welcome.
I think I agree with that a little bit, but if you talk to any of those companies like ASML or Rolls-Royce, they're gaining. They're not gaining market. The same number of planes will be sold 10 years from now as now. It's just a question of who makes those planes. Their sales of jet engines or ASML sales of steppers and other chip making machines doesn't change. Either the Chinese are making them or the Japanese or the Israelis or whoever. It doesn't make any difference. So I agree with you, but the key thing that has to happen, and there's no way GE is going to politically allow us to stop. Well, they can try it. Let's say they will oppose us saying stop selling jet engines to COMAC because they know Rolls-Royce will sell them. And so the only way to solve this problem is you have to get the Europeans to get their head out of their you-know-what, to stop thinking that they're the ones who are going to be making the money on China and when we get hurt. I mean, it drives me crazy when I go to Europe and I hear, oh yeah, you guys started the US-China trade war. I'm like, first of all, we're the tip of the spear that's fighting that war for you. And secondly, we didn't start it, the Chinese started it. So, unless we can get these countries to understand their own long-term interests, and they're either on the side of the democratic, allied, free market world, or they're not. It just boils down to that. And in particular, the Japanese are way better, I think. The Japanese will be on our side. The Europeans is really, to me, that's where the battleground will be fought.
I think that's changing too because of geopolitics. I mean, what people are seeing, for example, in Europe, and this was such an important moment in the recent NATO summit, was to see 32 NATO member states, which is half the world economy, call China the primary enabler of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. So I think one of the things that we have to do is remember that this is about geopolitics. This is ultimately about the use of strategic power, including violent military power. You take the Russia-China relationship, which they call it the comprehensive strategic partnership of coordination for a new era. And there's no question that from the very beginning, China has been bankrolling that war, supplying the technology and supplying the general economic heft to allow Putin to win. So I think that's helping people in Europe understand. And ultimately, this is about us aligning geopolitically to secure our economic future, to secure our own long-term security. And then that's going to be a bifurcated global economy. And the companies, I think a lot of this is going to get done in corporate strategy that realizes what happens to you at the end of the China engagement road.
Right.
At the end of that, you lose a whole lot of things, starting with the China market.
Yeah, and of course, in the SAFE universe, where we are crystally focused is in the critical mineral security and the industrial materials, and also we do have a European initiative specifically to tie in our allies and bring in, the other major economies to create that bifurcated world. Unpleasant as it may be to envision, it's also necessary, because what's more unpleasant is to play forward this continued China war game in which we are so wholly dependent on them for everything that we need in our modern life. So before we close out, I mean, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've covered, the thinking. We've covered the key industries. We've covered the grand strategy. We've covered the law. Anything else that our panelists want to elucidate for our audience, or and specifically any further distillation of these issues in terms of batteries and critical minerals? I realize that's a two-part question.
I think one of the things that I worry about is there's so many phrases we use, and there are a number of them that I really think are quite misleading. One of them is de-risking. Oh, well, it's a few things here and there, and we'll just de-risk. Actually, the term we should be using is destroy, because that's what the Chinese want to do. And so when we look at de-risking, which I don't get me wrong, yes, we should de-risk certain things. Minerals was a good example. Critical minerals was a good example. Ships is a good example. But if it just stops there, then they destroy all these other companies, I don't think it's enough. I actually think on a lot of these issues, first of all, I don't think any of this is ultimately hard to do. I mean, I agree with John. We could do this tomorrow. We could do it within 10 years. We could completely turn the tables. We could be back on top. When I say we, meaning the West, we choose not to do that. I mean, that's what we have to understand. There are things that would be hard to do, just like it couldn't be done. But this isn't one of those. But the minerals thing to me seems easy, which is you just set a price floor that nobody can sell, the Chinese cannot sell into global markets below a certain price, and that just gives security to companies, and they know they're never going to be undercut. I remember, if you remember, you probably remember this case, the Zenith Matsushitsu case.
TVs, yeah.
From the 70s. This was Chinese dumping, and the courts, in their infinite non-wisdom, they ruled against Zenith because they said, it's irrational for companies to dump because they lose money. Well, we're not dealing with a company here. We're dealing with a system. And as Rick pointed out, that system, it's very rational for them to engage in price predation. Price predation is a core part of the strategy. So I think we also have to recognize that we have to figure out a way to protect our companies from price predation, and that would include in critical minerals.
I would add one thing, which is forming allied industry clusters and allied supply chains. I mean, you look at the battery market, where JP Morgan estimates that China has about 77% of total battery manufacturing capacity. I mean, we shouldn't be there. Everybody should be concerned about that. But the supply and demand aspects of this, where you have as far as I understand, very capable South Korean battery makers, very capable Japanese battery makers. I mean, do those deals. Do those deals. Those are the deals that will work. They'll be secure. You don't want to be with cattle. I mean, we can see where that's gone in U.S. politics already. And a company like cattle, if that doesn't get the Huawei treatment in the next, in the 2020s, one should be very surprised. I mean, they're going to be Chinese companies that we are going to have to go after with economic strike packages, and I think we're going to do some of that. So getting into a more secure system where you're working with allies, where you're forming corporate alliances on the stuff that needs to be secured for the long run. Those are decisions that companies can make today.
If I could just make one quick point, because you brought up Huawei, and maybe other folks don't agree with this, but I think what I worry about in this is, well, we should cut off China. And in a lot of ways, we should cut off their imports. I get that, and we should try to figure out ways to harm them. But to me, selling things into the Chinese market can be very, very much in the U.S. interest. There's a fixed amount of market for semiconductors. I don't mind selling Huawei semiconductors, especially ones that they can get on their own. We'd be better off at least having our companies in those sales. So that's why I think we have to be very careful and strategic about what we do. We want to, we don't want to cut our nose off and spite our own face. We want to shoot them in the foot, but not ourselves.
Interesting longer conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, probably just to sort of jump in there, I think probably Jonathan and I would be a little more on the other side, which is that you're creating avenues for influence. One of the problems is that if a U.S. company is selling into there, and particularly, the PRC is very good at sort of giving, loss leader concessionary access to things, knowing that once they get you hooked, like the drug dealer, right, that now you have to come back, and that's when they start to come with sort of the Faustian bargain. And I don't disagree with you. I mean, I think if there is sort of, if they're the right kind of guardrails, and to your earlier point, look, there was a recent study out of the New York Fed, I think just a month and a half, 2 months ago, that looked at export controls, right? And they have almost no impact on trade flows, right? So for weapon systems, for sort of very strategic, sort of very, very strategic national security weapon systems type structures, export controls have use. The way that they, or at least the post COCOM export control structure, right? So the Wassenaar export control structure only really works for weapon systems, high-end weapon systems. The COCOM structure that we had under the Cold War, that was vastly different. That was all the allies and partners came together and said, you can't sell any of this stuff, right? It undermines our collective national security. It undermines our collective economic security. So part of what you're arguing for, I would say, is we need a revitalization of COCOM. We need to bring our allies and partners together and say, quite frankly, you can't be a member of NATO. You can't be part of our market. You can't be considered an ally if you can't agree with us that we can't lose semiconductors, we can't lose aviation, we can't lose quantum, we can't lose AI, we can't lose critical minerals, right? And so if we all agree upon this, then there's definitely a way where we can create a COCOM structure that says, you know what, Airbus and Boeing can only sell the exact same number of planes to the PRC. They can't do finishing work there. They can't transfer technology. They can simply go and offer up planes, finished and completed in each other's markets, and BAE and GE and Rolls-Royce, you guys can't sell to them either, right? So you're still going to sell those jet engines because their market wants to buy jets, and they're going to buy, because they can't sell COMAX without the other inputs anyway. Those planes won't fly. Tomorrow they will stop flying if you take away the jets and the Honeywells and the other stuff. And so their market is going to need to be fed. The same thing about semiconductor, I agree completely, right? Those sales from ASML, actually last quarter, 60% of all ASML products went to the PRC, right? That is destroying their current customer base, full stop, right? But there is a little bit of a goose. There's a short-term goose. They actually will make extras because as the overcapacity builds, they'll short-term get extra sales. But in the end, the market for semiconductors is the market for semiconductors. The world is going to buy so many cell phones. The world's going to buy so many smart cars. The world's going to buy so many computers. And that's the market for semiconductors, right? And so they can either be made by those tools in Taiwan and Korea, the United States and Europe and Japan, or they can be made in the PRC. And that's really the sort of the bargain we're looking at here. And so you can maybe think you're getting more sales, but the reality is you're not. Well, you're not getting more sales.
Yeah, but again, it's sort of, to me, it's this sort of, black and white thing. I think tool sales should be limited. I think that's a real choke point, and it is enabling. I don't think selling them a 25 nanometer chip hurts them at all. It hurts us. So I think we've got to, again, be much more strategic in how we think about that. There's certain things that could cripple them. I support tool bans, absolutely, but I don't support sort of, what did we get from telling Intel you can't sell the Huawei? We got nothing, other than Intel now has less revenue, which hurts the US.
Well, unfortunately, I don't think we're going to pull apart all these challenges today. I wish we could, but what we do know is that we need more long-term thinking, greater diplomacy, stronger trade policy on certain critical industries, and I think what I'm hearing most of all is that we're going to need some political will. But thank you to our panel for coming together for this important conversation. There's more to come. We will be announcing the date of our next conversation, which will continue to drill in on these solutions. That's likely to be in August. I want to thank the panel again. I want to thank our audience for their questions, and we'll see you soon.